we expect Congressman Cohen and Congressman Davis to come give some remarks. I guess they're running a little later. They have some other events that they're at. And when they come in, I guess we'll stop and let them give their remarks. But otherwise, we're going to get started with the panel. And I'll go ahead and introduce the first panelist, Jen Mishory, who will also be moderating the discussion. So Jen is Deputy Director of Young Invincibles, where she directs policy, research, communications, and outreach staff. She's authored numerous reports and issue briefs focusing on health, higher education, and economic issues facing the millennial generation. She's testified before Congress on the issue of private student loans and serves as a member of the inaugural Consumer Advisory Board as a CFPB. She also served as the Consumer Advocacy Negotiator for the Department of Education's 2012 negotiated rulemaking on student loans. And she's appeared in the Wall Street Journal, CNN, NPR, and PBS, among other outlets. She's a graduate of UCLA, from which she graduated in 2007 and received her law degree from Georgetown University Law Center in 2010. We'll be moderating our discussion today.
Thanks so much, James. Thanks everyone for coming. Oh, it's loud. As James said, I think when the members are able to pop in, we'll just take a break and hear from them a little bit on the issue of private student debt and how it's impacting their constituents. But for now, I'm just going to panel. We'll get right into a discussion about private student loans. So first on my left, we have Sandy Baum. Sandy Baum is an independent higher education policy analyst and consultant. She's a senior fellow at the George Washington University Graduate School of Education and Human Development and a professor emerita of economics at Skidmore College. Dr. Baum earned her BA in sociology at Bryn Mawr College and her Ph.D. in economics at Columbia University. She has written and spoken extensively on issues relating to college access, college pricing, student aid policy, student debt, affordability, and higher education finance. Dr. Baum is a senior associate at the Institute for Higher Education Policy, an affiliated consultant for HGM strategists, and a consultant to the College Board, where she has co-authored the annual publications Trends in Student Aid and Trends in College Pricing, which I know we reference a lot in our work, as well as Education Pays, the Benefits of Higher Education for Individuals and Society. She also chaired the College Board's Rethinking Student Aid Study Group and Rethinking Pell Grants Study Group. To her left, we have David Hawkins. He's the Director of Public Policy and Research for the National Association of College Admission and Counseling. The National Association of College Admission and Counseling, also commonly referred to as NACAC, is based in Arlington, Virginia. NACAC is a nonprofit membership association that represents more than 20,000 high school counselors and college admission officers from across the country. NACAC is devoted to making the transition high school and post-secondary education equitable, transparent, and fair. Mr. Hawkins holds a BA and an MA in government from the College of William and Mary. And to his left, we have Daniel Press. Mr. Press practices primarily bankruptcy and intellectual property law. He's a magna cum laude graduate of Georgetown University Law Center, my alma mater as well, and he was an editor at the Georgetown Journal. He received his BA from Johns Hopkins University. After graduating from law school, Mr. Press served as a judicial clerk for District Court Judge Jaime Pérez Jr. in Puerto Rico. Mr. Press, along with Brett Weiss, are the authors of a leading book on Chapter 11 bankruptcy for individuals, entitled Chapter 11 for Individual Debtors. Mr. Press primarily practices in the bankruptcy and federal district courts in the DMV area, but also in courts across the country. He is on the board of directors as well as a state chair for the National Association of Consumer Bankruptcy Attorneys and a member of the Section Council of the Consumer Bankruptcy Section of the Maryland State Bar. He is a regular speaker on bankruptcy and related topics at seminars and programs locally and nationwide. Sure. And I'll turn it over to the Congressman.
Thank you, and good afternoon, and I want to thank everybody for their participation in this briefing, and I also want to say how I guess you all are in the same boat, but Jen, who is moderating here, the Young Invincibles, you'll learn. It happens to all of us if we're lucky. This is a major issue, an important issue, and something that the Congress needs to deal with. I want to thank everybody for coming on this, and we hopefully will have some good information. A hallmark of the American dream is having an opportunity to obtain a higher education. This day and time, bachelor's work, you really need a master's to get ahead. The economy is not so good for employment, even for graduates. Education is a way out of poverty and can be a key to a better future. And you're going to earn more, you're going to enjoy life, you're going to know more if you have an education. And we're competing in a universal competition for jobs. So it's even more important because you're not just competing with kids in different states, you're competing with people all over the world. So for those facing long-term unemployment, and there are those that will, education and job training may be the only means of finding gainful employment. Encouraging our citizens to obtain higher education is critical to spurring innovation and maintaining our nation's global economic leadership, which is, of course, being challenged by our neighbors to the east. Last month, however, Forbes magazine reported the total student loan debt exceeded $1 trillion, which is more than America's total credit card debt. $1 trillion, and it's the next looming crisis we have. If you can't pay off your student loans, you're not going to be able to buy a new car or buy a house, and the housing industry and the automotive industry are very important to our economy, so there are ripple effects therein. Because of the soaring cost of higher educations, more and more Americans are being forced to borrow in order to pay their way. And in these still uncertain economic times, there's no guarantee graduates will quickly obtain employment. There's no guarantee. There's proof to the contrary. Add to this the perfect storm that our nation's bankruptcy law over the past 30 years has been altered to make it virtually impossible to discharge student loans in bankruptcy for those who fall on hard times after graduation and must resort to bankruptcy relief. That was the BAPCISA law that passed before I got to Congress. If I was here, wouldn't have happened. I feel like Steven Seagal when I was in Russia with him, and he came up to the school, and there were 300 deaths in a terrorist act in 2004, and he said, if I was here, nobody would have died. I thought, right. But Congress has extended this non-dischargeability on student loans from unscrupulous private lenders and even scrupulous ones who charge the unscrupulous ones, the ones that charge the exorbitant interest rates and whose products often lack the consumer protections of federal student loans. The original rationale for making education loans non-dischargeable was to protect the financial integrity of the student loan program and ultimately taxpayer dollars. With the enactment of BAPCISA, Bankruptcy, Abuse Prevention, and Consumer Protection Act, and it's a joke. I mean, what a ridiculous title. It's put on that hand as a handle because it wasn't consumer protection at all. This protection was for the lenders was extended to for-profit, privately funded student loans for which the taxpayer protection rationale did not apply. Worse yet, the 2005 amendment was never the subject of any formal congressional hearings, no empirical evidence showing its necessity other than bald assertions for the for-profit student loan industry that such a change was necessary to prevent debtor abuse. And so hundreds of thousands of Americans who borrowed private student loans and are now financially struggling are left without an adequate remedy. According to the National Consumer Law Center, there are more than 850,000 private student loans currently in default, and thousands of other borrowers struggling to make payments on those loans. And according to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau's August 2012 report on private student loans, Americans owe more than $150 billion in outstanding private student loan debt. Honest but unfortunate debtors seeking relief from crushing financial burdens now only have a very limited opportunity to get out from under their old student loans as they struggle to make their way back to a sound financial footing. That's why Congressman Danny Davis of Chicago and I introduced H.R. 532, the Private Student Loan Bankruptcy Fairness Act of 2013, and why we introduced this measure in the last two Congresses as well. This bill would simply restore the bankruptcy law to where it was before 2005 by making private student loan debt dischargeable in bankruptcy like other types of unsecured consumer debt, like credit cards. There's no principled justification to treat private, for-profit student loan debt differently from other kinds of debt, such as credit cards, payday loans, or personal loans. Private student loan lenders have abused the favorable treatment they were granted in 2005 in the Bankruptcy Code. They have marketed loans without with exorbitant interest rates and fees. They have failed to adequately disclose important loan terms. They have insisted on inflexible repayment options, and they've included unduly harsh default provisions in loan agreements. Continued protections for these lenders is not justified whatsoever. I thank each of our panelists for participating in today's event, and I thank you all in this audience for coming. Briefly, kind of go back to my time as a Tennessee senator, and my signature bill was passing the Tennessee Education Lottery that gives young people certain monies if they get a certain grade average in high school and maintain it in college. It helps some in Tennessee, one of the few places where we're not challenging Mississippi, Alabama, and Arkansas for the bottom. So that was a good thing. I thank Congressman Davis and Congressman Miller, ranking member of the Committee on Education and Workforce, for their leadership on this issue as well, and I look forward to a fruitful discussion. And now back to the invincible one.
Thank you so much. And thank you for your leadership on this issue. I think we're going to kick off the panel with just a couple minutes of remarks from each panelist about their background and experience in this issue. And then we'll go into a discussion, a brief history about the private student loan market, why students may opt for private loans versus federal loans, and what drives that decision, some of the problems with the private student loan market, and then also solutions to help students who may be struggling under private student loan debt. So why don't we kick it over to Sandy to tell us a little bit about this.
Thank you. Well, as Jen said, I'm an economist, and I've been thinking about student aid issues, policies for many more years than most of you have been alive, looking around this room, actually. And I do publish every year the College Board's Trends in Student Aid and Trends in College Pricing publications, and I will share with you later some data on what has happened to the private student loan market, because we have put a lot of energy into collecting that. But I also have done a lot of work on how much students can afford to pay in repaying their student loans, what's manageable debt, how much are student loans causing problems. And I would just to, as an advanced statement, I mean, I'm very much out there saying it's not true that student loan debt is a disaster. It's not like we should forgive everybody's student debt. That's a blanket solution. Student loans aren't a bad thing, but they are very bad for some people. They do cause dramatic problems for individual students, and this bankruptcy provision, like if you could discharge in bankruptcy, that's helping the people who have the problems, and it's hard to see why that's not a good solution. It's such an important step.
I see Congressman Davis is here.
And I think we'll take another pause.
I don't want to stop anything. I don't ever want to stop anything. Steve, how you doing?
Good, thank you. Take my chair, take that microphone, and I'll just sit back here for a minute.
No, we're fine. Actually, I'm going to be
There and sit next to the Invincibles.
just a minute, and let me thank all of you, first of all, for coming and for being here. And I certainly want to thank all of those who have come to participate, be engaged, and be involved in this briefing. I think, as a matter of fact, that the discussion that you're having and we're having this afternoon is one of the most important ones that we could have, especially as it relates to education, the opportunity to make it as affordable as it can possibly become. And of course, we're all faced with the immediate crisis of what do we do? And it's amazing to me that we would bring ourselves to this point where we're right on the verge of something changing drastically unless something happens immediately. And so figuring out what it is that we can do, how we can do it, and how we can keep education within the reach of as many people as we possibly can, I think that is commendable. It's a good way to spend Monday afternoon following Father's Day, and I've been telling, father stories about my father, because I think fatherhood and all is so important. And he was a firm believer in education, even though he only completed 4th grade. But he was an avid reader, and I picked up from him that reading was important, and had I not done that, given the circumstances of our being, I probably wouldn't be here today as a member of Congress working on these great issues and trying to find solutions. And so I'm still celebrating Father's Day. So go ahead and keep on going.
Okay, thank you to both congressmen here. I think this is an important issue, and I appreciate the opportunity to provide some input from our association. As Jen said, NACAC, which is one of the more interesting acronyms you'll hear in D.C., is an association of high school counselors and college admission officers at nonprofit institutions around the country. One of the unique things about NACAC is that we were formed in 1937 by a group of colleges who recognized that competition between colleges could get pretty intense and sometimes pretty underhanded. So they formed our organization to set up a system of principles of practice so that institutions wouldn't kill each other off with dubious practices, and that students wouldn't become collateral damage in the process. So we, to this day, maintain our statement of principles of good practice, which was established to maintain some sort of equilibrium between the rights of students and the interests of institutions in the transition to college. So you can see where our interests, based on our mission, brings us to this issue. And I think the four things that brought us into this specific issue of bankruptcy for private student loans was that we see that there's with the increasing number of students who borrow private student loans, there is also a burgeoning information asymmetry that exists with more students, particularly first-generation students coming into the pipeline, the ability to comprehend the college application process first and foremost, but then even more intimidating, the financial aid and the process of borrowing is becoming increasingly a policy issue that we have to address. Part of the reason it's becoming a policy issue is the second reason we come to this issue, and that is that there's really not a lot of systemic help for students who are looking to enroll and who have to borrow, particularly, again, low-income first-generation students. In the high schools, our counselors are stretched to the breaking point, and for adult students, there really aren't any systemic resources. Our financial aid administrators do a great job in colleges, but many students only reach them once they've started the process of enrolling. So there's a problem out in the system to help people get good information and to make informed decisions. And then thirdly, as Jen mentioned earlier, and Sandy, that there's been evidence over the last decade of increasingly predatory practices, particularly among the for-profit colleges, where students have been recruited under false pretenses and then often saddled with loans above and beyond what they can get from the federal programs, often at very, very substantial risk to the students. In fact, if you haven't read Senator Hawkins' report out of the Help Committee on for-profit colleges, you really ought to take a look at it. It talks a lot also about the private lending practices of those institutions. And then finally, fourth and finally, our interest in maintaining some sort of equilibrium, as Congressman Cohen mentioned, leads us to this issue of bankruptcy protection, because in the federal program, the loan program, where students are getting very good interest rates, very good benefits in case they have trouble paying off the loans, in exchange they're asked that these loans sort of stay active for throughout the duration. They are assessed the market risk when they borrow a private loan. So they're saddled with high interest rates, essentially what the market will do if they're afraid that the borrower is not going to pay back. So when Congress gave them this back-end support of not allowing these loans to be discharged in bankruptcy, they essentially put the borrowers between a rock and a hard place. And so the borrower has been hit on the front end by the high interest rates and is then again hit on the back end by not being able to declare bankruptcy on these loans, as Sandy mentioned. So that's how we came to the issue.
Thanks. So we've talked about the how we get in the problem, and as a bankruptcy attorney, we deal with this problem on the back end. Let me talk briefly about what bankruptcy is and what it is not, because I think there's a big misconception out there about bankruptcy. Because the credit industry has, built this impression that, the bankruptcy debtor is somehow irresponsible, that people are just out there running up debt willy-nilly and then just filing bankruptcy to get rid of it. And that's really the farthest thing from the truth. We just, in my practice, we just don't see that kind of person. What we see are people who have been struggling with debt often for many years. They've exhausted all their resources, and they come to us as a last resort. They've been responsible, but they've often fallen into credit situations with very high interest rates, with very onerous terms. And these private student loans are one of the chief culprits in that. These are not people who irresponsibly run up debt. They're people who have medical problems, who may have job loss, may have divorce issues. We have people who are disabled veterans. They were fine before they got called up into active duty, and they get injured in Iraq or Afghanistan, and they can't make what they made before. And we have people who, for whatever reason, they get into an educational situation that doesn't work out for them. They get into one of these for-profit institutions, or even a regular, university, and they can't make what they thought they would make because the economy has failed them, because the job market isn't what they had hoped it would be, and they end up saddled with debt that's just impossible to repay. And we can help them with credit card debt. We can help them with tax debt. We can help them with mortgage debt. We can help them with medical debt. Just about the only thing we can't help them with is student loan debt. And really there should be, from our perspective, no difference with the private student loans between how those loans are treated and how other sorts of loans like credit card debt or mortgage debt or medical debt are treated. You can discharge taxes. Why can't we discharge these private student loans?
Thanks so much. And just for the audience, so you know, we will have some time for questions at the end. We'll leave some time. I wanted to throw it back to Sandy, and I know you brought a few slides just to talk about the history of the private student loan market and what's changed over the past couple decades and even the past couple years.
Yeah, I think it's important to put the private student loan market into perspective. So this, as I said, I every year collect the volume of private student loans to publish in Trends in Student Aid. You would be amazed at how hard it is actually to do that, because the lenders don't want to tell you and it's not always public. And I've spent many years sort of calling lenders and developing relationships to get them to tell me. Finally, they now have a third-party person who collects the data, so they don't know about each other. But it's really pretty dramatic. So there was, in 1995-96, there was not much of a market, and it grew gradually, and then it grew pretty rapidly, and by 2007-08, there were $25 billion of private student loans issued, huge, and then the market crashed. And many of these loans were made to people who had really no hope of ever paying them back, sort of like the subprime mortgage market. And so when the market crashed, and the lenders no longer wanted to make those loans, and also at the same time, the federal government increased the amount that students could borrow from the federal government. And so it wasn't that total student lending decreased, it was that the federal government stepped in and allowed students to borrow loans to replace these private loans that were gone, which is great because federal student loans carry repayment protection, so you don't have the same problems. But if you look now, it's about $8 billion. And that's a really different thing. Most people don't think it's going to really come back. So as a percentage of total education borrowing, it really was about a quarter of education borrowing. That's dramatic. And those loans are still out there. So when we talk about bankruptcy, we're not talking just about new loans. And we really are less worried about the new loans than we are about the loans that are out there. It's about 7% of the education loan market now. And as has been mentioned, you're much more likely to have those loans if you enroll in a for-profit school than if you enroll in another kind of institution. Now, part of that is that, there are lots of reasons for that, and we can get into those, but it's important that there are people who went to all kinds of schools who end up, and particularly private nonprofit institutions also, who borrow private loans in addition to, or sometimes unfortunately instead of federal loans, but it's not most people. About 14% of people, of students in 2007-08 took private loans, and disproportionately those at for-profit schools. So again, the market has shrunk a lot. That's a good thing. I would be happy if we had no term called private student loans. If you put it on your credit card, I don't have the graph, but if you look at the graph of the $1 trillion that everybody talks about, and you know how that's gone up, if everybody put on their credit card, then student loan debt wouldn't be bigger than credit card debt, and we could stop saying that, but nobody would be better off except the people who want to discharge in bankruptcy, who then could do so.
Thanks, Andy. And maybe we could talk a little bit about why students end up taking those private student loans, given some of the differences. We mentioned a little bit about the types of schools they might be attending, and also about the information asymmetry. We did a survey of our online membership, and about 2/3 said they didn't fully understand the difference between a federal and private loan. It's a really high number. David, do you maybe want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. You know, the question, first, I'll give two parts to the answer. The first part is why would a student take out a private loan? In the best case scenario, a student that's going to, I'll use the term legitimate or reputable institution, a lot of gray there, of course, but let's just say that the student is lined up to attend the college of his or her choice. The cost of going to that college may exceed the amount of grant aid and federal loan eligibility that student qualifies for. So, and they may not have the family income to cover that in cash. So a private loan in the best of cases helps bridge the gap between what a student gets and what a student has to pay out of their own pocket. Now, even in those situations, private loans tend to carry higher interest rates and, as we've said a number of times, have next to no protections on the back end, on the repayment end, as a federally backed loan does. Now, in some of the worst case scenarios, we've seen institutions that have essentially pushed these private loans on students as a way of complying with the federal government's requirement that they get 10% of their tuition money from non-federal sources. So essentially they're piling private loan money on top of all of the federal grants and loans that they can get, thus jacking up the price of the tuition and the amount of debt that the student gets into, just so they can say they obtain 10% of their revenue from a non-federal source. So that's obviously gaming the system, and it puts students who are already in vulnerable positions and who are at risk of default and other negative outcomes from these loans in an even worse position. So those are a couple of reasons why, and obviously they represent sort of polar instances. There could be a little bit of everything in between. But as Jen said, many students, you know, I've always noted that when students come out of elementary and secondary education, they're in a more or less trusting environment. I mean, you know, you went to school, you were sort of shepherded through the process. When you get to higher education, it's an entirely different situation. But very few of us had any real formal education in how that works. You assume that the college that you're going to enroll in is a trusting environment, a trustworthy environment. So you don't have reason to think that they're going to rip you off. And frankly, that's what's happening in some places. So I think if this was a free and fair market where consumers had all of the information they needed to make informed decisions, it would be a different conversation. But they don't. And that's part of this very complicated and multifaceted issue that we're trying to address. And the bankruptcy issue is, I think, a very clean and very, I guess, intuitive fix to what happens when a market is so thoroughly distorted in many cases at the front end.
And Daniel, do you have any other comments on some of the information asymmetry that maybe your clients come in with?
Sure. You know, we talk about, again, this issue of personal responsibility, and that's what a lot of the impetus behind the 2005 bankruptcy bill was based on. But we're not talking about, you know, people who have been out in the market, in business or whatever for years. We're talking about, you know, 18-year-old kids who may or may not have had some kind of a financial literacy class in school. Hopefully, more and more states are doing that. But in most cases, they're not. They don't even have any kind of financial literacy class. They are thrust into this situation of paying now for something that is often more expensive than their parents' house. If you think about it, I mean, private schools, I'm not even talking about the for-profit schools, but private universities are now, you're talking $50,000 a year for tuition alone or more at a lot of these schools. So you're talking, you know, for 4 years, you're talking $200,000. And that's more than a lot of these people's houses cost. How do they pay for that? And so they're being given paper to sign. And we don't want to say no. The parents don't want to say no. Their counselors don't want to say no. As a society, we don't want to say no. And so they're going to do what they perceive is necessary to get that education that they think is going to get them ahead. And so they sign this paperwork, thinking it's going to provide them a bright future. And in many cases it does. And in many cases they can pay it back. And good for them. And that's still the majority. But it doesn't work that way for everybody. You know, there are people who don't make it through school or don't get the economic benefit out of this education. And they don't see that going in. They don't perceive that risk going in because nobody tells them about it. Nobody tells them that if they go to college and pursue their dreams, and you know, I have one client who's a graduate of the Columbia School of Journalism. She got the degree she wanted at the school she wanted, one of the best schools out there for what she wanted to study. And she got the job she wanted. But the job pays less than $50,000 a year. And she has over $200,000 of student loan debt, half of it private. How can she ever repay that? And you don't think about that going in. Nobody does. And so we need to have this protection, and it's not an issue of, you know, saying, well, you know, people should have personal responsibility for themselves, because you're not dealing with people who have the tools at that stage of their life to have that personal responsibility that the opponents of this legislation, you know, think they should have.
Cindy, do you have anything on the information piece?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think a really important, I mean, we all seem to agree on, basically on the position, but one thing that to me is very important is that the stories that you hear about students who borrow $100,000 for their undergraduate education, these are very rare stories. I mean, something like 1%, less than 1% would borrow that much. They all get on the front page of the newspaper. They have problems, and they may have had problems before. I mean, you should tell everybody they shouldn't do that. So they did not have information ahead of time. People should have better information about, you know, not getting into that situation. But the issue is that, so when some of the conversation about student loans, like especially in the public press, makes it sound as though everybody is drowning in debt, and what we really need is a huge solution for lots of people. But the reality is that some people really made mistakes you would have known up front that they were mistakes, and other people had unanticipated events they could never have known. They couldn't finish school for whatever reason. The job they trained for no longer exists. They went to a school that doesn't certify you accurately. They couldn't have done anything about that. But it's not going to bankrupt the nation to let those people not pay back their loans. And in particular, one of the issues is that if you have a private student loan and you don't pay it back, it's the lender who made that loan to you and probably shouldn't have made it who's going to swallow that. And there are a lot of other proposals out there and to tackle this really important problem, but they involve sometimes making the lender whole, like pay back the loan for the student converted into a federal loan. You don't really want to pay back that private lender and make the taxpayer pay. You really want to make it so that the people who did the irresponsible lending or provided the irresponsible education are holding the bag, not the taxpayers. And the people, lots of people have been really harmed by this economy. There are people who have student loans they can't pay back. There are people who lost their homes. There are people who've lost their jobs. And a lot of people are really struggling because of the economy. And we want to make sure that we're helping the targeted group of people that we really want to help, because it's not like people go to college are better off by and large than other people. We don't want taxpayers in general to have a huge burden for paying for people, everybody who has a student loan. But the people who are really suffering, as these clients are, they're the people who need the help.
And we have a question over here.
Sandy, let me ask you, I couldn't see your graph real well, but for-profit colleges, and David, you hit on that too, how much are for-private colleges really the problem here, in that they're getting their 10% and they're getting folks with promises that aren't realistic about jobs, and those loans are driving them? When I flew up here today, I saw a fellow at the airport, and I said, how you doing? Going to Washington, being honored by Strayer University. Oh, wow, that's great. They're having a banquet at the Ritz-Carlton, and they're putting me up at the Ritz-Carlton tonight, and they're flying me back tomorrow. Well, you know, they could have stayed at, what is that hotel that starts with the H, the Harrington. You know, could have made a lot more sense. But tell me about for-profit colleges.
I'm sure everybody has a comment. There are half of the student loan defaults are for the for-profit colleges. So we know, and almost everybody who goes to a for-profit college borrows. Big part of the problem. There are very good for-profit colleges, and there are terrible for-profit colleges. And so it's always dangerous to paint with a broad brush. There are nonprofit colleges where students don't get a good education, where they have almost no chance of graduating, and where they borrow a lot. So it's not a clear line between the sectors. That said, if we didn't have the for-profit college problem, the whole student loan scene would look very different, and many of the worst problems would not exist. But we do have them, we do need them, and we need to figure out how to protect students from these abuses.
Yeah, I would agree. The Harkin report in the Senate noted some of the predatory practices that were going on, and cited that at 9 of the very largest for-profit colleges, the private loan default rate was between 42 and 80% at these 9 colleges. And I think that in my mind, what the for-profit college sector does is it provides an example of how a market can be contorted, so that the borrowers, the students who are coming into the process, are really not entering the market on the terms that I think we would all, no matter where we fit on the ideological spectrum, would agree as being sort of a fair market, a fair shake out of a transaction. So I think they've provided a really good example of how that process can be distorted, and how institutions can take advantage of that information asymmetry, where students are signing away tens of thousands of dollars without even understanding what they're doing. And as Sandy said, I think the magnitude of the problem, I think we would all still be interested in this bankruptcy issue, but the magnitude of the problem would be quite a bit smaller had we not had the last decade of predatory recruiting.
Yeah, I'm certainly not an expert on the private college issue, but one thing that I will say is that, if a lender is lending into a market where you have 40% and upwards default rates, there's something wrong. There's not something wrong with the borrowers. There's something wrong with the lenders. And the responsibility there is on the lenders, and they shouldn't then be allowed to, to walk away and chase these people forever when it's really their fault for making these irresponsible loans.
But the fact that they can't chase them forever is probably the reason why they give them loans.
Well, that's right, because if you have a 40% default rate, but they're never going to be able to discharge it, okay. So you got to go get a judgment, and you're going to chase them forever, renew the judgment, and eventually you'll probably get paid. Meanwhile, that judgment is accruing interest at the loan rate, which might be the loan default rate, which might be in the 20s and upwards percent interest. So, yeah, I mean, if you're going to charge 20% on 20% interest or 24% interest on loans that, okay, there's a 40% default rate, that's all right, you'll make it back.
Where would we think that the critical point is? I often wonder whether or not high school counselors are being as effective as perhaps they could be, given the marketplace and knowing how businesses actually work in our capitalistic society. I mean, one could make the same argument that persons who got high interest mortgages when the real estate, I know friends of mine who were earning $65,000, $70,000 a year buying $300,000 mortgages, and I mean, how do you pay the mortgage? And is there some point or some place where we could perhaps do a more effective job? Because if there are not buyers, doesn't matter what you're selling, you're not going to do well at it. I mean, that's what I tell kids. You can have as many dope dealers on the street, but if nobody's buying, they can't sell. And so prevention really becomes much of what I think we need to do, even with the student loan situation.
That's an excellent point. I mentioned earlier that we lack a good systemic process for educating students about how to how to approach the process of financing college. And when we talk to our school counselor members, it becomes pretty evident that while 90% of the public schools out there rely on their school counselors to provide financial aid information for college, about 2/3 to 3/4 of those counselors have said that they don't get enough training or education in what they're supposed to be telling the students. And one of the questions that counselors find the most difficult to deal with students and families in the high school setting is whether to borrow for college and how much. So at that level, there is quite a bit of education that needs to happen. And obviously, school counselors are stretched to the limit. They have a lot of duties. There aren't as many of them in the schools as we'd like. And given this budget situation that we're in, we're not likely to improve on that anytime in the next year or two. But certainly what we'd want is better education. I think you've seen a lot of transparency initiatives coming out of the federal government, better consumer information, and ultimately that helps. I think that's exactly the point that we try to make. But again, once those students leave high school, who's out there to help them? It'd be nice to get it to them while they're in school, so maybe they'll remember it as they move out throughout their career. But then you have your adult learners and your military learners and all the different types of people who are flowing into higher education now. So this is why, again, bringing it now back from the transparency and front end of the process to the back end, you really have to, I think when we look at this market in its totality, there are lots of moving parts. And education is a really critical front end part, and this bankruptcy provision on the private loan system is a crucial back end point.
I just want to say that this point about older learners is really important because high school guidance counselors, if we had more and better trained ones, could help a lot. But many of the students borrowing a lot of money are starting school when they're older. They disproportionately go to for-profit schools. They disproportionately do not complete the programs that they start and end up in trouble. And we have to have a way to get better information to those people before they borrow. And And one of the information problems is we have some very good moves to put more information out there. There's actually a lot of information out there. People don't know how to access and process that information. Look at the behavioral economics literature. I mean, we just put more and more information out there, and people just say, I don't know, and then they just do whatever flashes across their screen. And that's part of the private loan problem.
You know, let me say, I mean, I certainly think that more and better disclosures up front and more and better education about this up front is a good thing. I mean, the more information you provide, the better. But, you know, how many of you read all the fine print on your credit card applications? And I mean, that's what we're saying is, you know, okay, let's give them better truth in lending disclosures and that sort of thing. Great, do it, but don't expect that that's going to solve the problem, because people don't read it, they don't understand it, and whatever is going to be mandated by the federal government, the lenders are going to find a way to still present this as, you know, a wonderful tool for these students. You know, let me say the other thing about, you know, as far as the high school counselors, I think they're trying to do the best job they can at the front end, and, you know, with limited resources. What I've seen with these private loans, though, is that, you know, yes, it's the older students, the private, the for-profit institutions, but even at the public universities and at the nonprofit universities, often what happens is, you know, the student will be admitted and they're given a financial aid package and they think they can afford it. And so for their freshman year, perhaps, they don't have any private student loans. Then tuition goes up. Maybe they didn't make the grades that they absolutely needed to keep some scholarship. Maybe a parent lost a job. Maybe there's a medical issue, and they still want to go to that school. You know, they've done 1 or 2 or 3 years there. And so they look to the private loan market to, you know, to supplement, and at that point, they don't really care. They think they're going to be invincible. They're going to make it if they just get that degree. And then, you know, they're carrying a 24% student loan, and on top of everything else, and they don't get the job they expected. Their parents are not in a position to help them out anymore, and it all falls apart.
Let me ask you if I could, do any of you find, let me phrase it this way, I believe that many of the decisions we make are based upon core value beliefs, that we believe that certain things ought to take place. And so I believe that many people think that higher education especially is a kind of privilege that one seeks and takes, as opposed to the notion that higher education should be a right. And if it's a right, then we build in these protections, such as being able to see student loans the same way that we see other kinds of debt. My question, are any of you finding any movement in terms of the core value beliefs where people are moving towards higher education as an expectation or as a need, the same way that there was a time when, say, a high school diploma was viewed as a need? Now are we beginning to see higher education in perhaps the same light?
I think that the federal government has done a great job of moving in the direction of removing the financial barriers for many students to go to college. I mean, if you look at the Pell Grant program and how much it has grown in recent years, and it is really helping, I mean, over 1/3 of students now benefit from the Pell Grant program. And I think if you ask the public, they say they understand that higher education is necessary for people to succeed. The question of how how you realize that goal. I mean, the problem is there are many people out there arguing that maybe, you know, too many people are going to college, and really they don't want to pay for other people's kids to go to college. Everybody who makes that argument wants their own kids to go to college, right? They just don't want to pay for other people's kids to go to college. So I think that there's broad acceptance of this idea, but again, people don't want to pay taxes at the state level to fund the public institutions, and they don't want to pay taxes at the federal level to help provide financial aid. So it's the idea of how are we as a society going to make it a realistic possibility for people, and then also how are we going to make sure that students are well positioned to take advantage of it, because one of the big problems with the student loan industry is that so many people start college and don't finish and then don't see the payoff. So education is the right path for most people, but too many people are falling off the path, and we have to solve that problem in order to strengthen the story of everybody really making that choice.
So we did a survey recently of borrowers just to hear about some of the issues they face when they are in distress. And a lot of folks responded, a huge percentage responded and said that their lenders are unwilling to work with them. And there's really, they don't know what to do. Can you, Daniel, maybe talk a little bit about what happens when clients come to you with private student loans and they don't have bankruptcy protections and they have nowhere to go? What's happening to them in their lives?
Well, it's absolutely correct that there's no incentive out there for the private student loan lenders to work with these people, because they're going to get repaid somehow, maybe 10, 20, 30 years down the road. They're going to get repaid. And that's their attitude. So why should they, you know, with a credit card, you know, I can negotiate with a credit card company, because if they don't work out a deal, then my client has the, you know, the fallback position of being able to file bankruptcy. With a student loan, with a private student loan, that's not there. The government student loans, there's, you know, of course, there's income-based repayment programs and income contingent repayment programs, and this whole panoply of ways to work out those loans so that you can get into an affordable program, but not with the private loans. They simply will sue, they will garnish, and they'll garnish your wages, they'll garnish your bank accounts, they'll, you know, if they can find your car, they'll take your car. They don't care, and because there's nothing out there to stop them. So what do we do? Well, I mean, there are some things we can do. You know, in many cases, we can put them in a Chapter 13 and at least limit the amount they're going to have to pay each month. But it doesn't do anything about the problem. They finish their Chapter 13, and they have to file another one right away, and another one, and another one. And so these people, if they don't want to have their wages garnished, either for the rest of their life or until the loan is repaid, they're going to be in bankruptcy for the rest of their life, and with no light at the end of the tunnel. At least that allows them to have a basic minimum standard of living, you know, to be able to pay their rent and put food on the table. But it's certainly not going to allow them to advance in society, not allow them to start a family, buy a house. Their credit's going to be ruined forever, because they're just going to be in bankruptcy forever, because otherwise they can't eat. And we have several people in that exact situation. And
so I want to open it up to questions. I think we have this room actually a little past 3, so if we go a few minutes over, I think it's okay. There's a microphone up here, so if folks want to just line up with any questions they have for the panel.
This is from a case called Bruner that basically defines what the undue hardship standard is for discharging student loans. Student loans, theoretically, but the standard says undue hardship. And the courts have defined that as basically being a complete hopelessness of ever being able to repay the loan, combined with having made your best efforts to having tried to repay the loan. The fact is, in most of these cases, we don't even try because the lenders fight these things really hard. Lenders, of course, have the resources, and our clients don't. That's why they're in bankruptcy. They don't have the money to be able to pay lawyers to fight. And, you know, the fact is most bankruptcy lawyers are, you know, we're not pro bono providers as our occupation. We're not legal aid. Legal aid can't afford, you know, legal aid is out there trying to do the best they can for the most people they can. And if they get into long, drawn-out litigation for one client trying to discharge a student loan debt, they won't have the resources to help people with their housing problems, or, you know, people with much simpler bankruptcy issues, or their divorces or whatever. So they need to allocate their resources. So there's private lawyers really can't fight these things, and the nonprofit agencies can't afford to dedicate what needs to be dedicated to fight these things. So, and that's true whether it's a public loan or a private loan. The Department of Education fights these things tooth and nail as well. But it's a virtually impossible standard to meet unless you are basically demonstrably medically incapacitated to the point that you really just never have any hope of working. And that you've, on top of that, that you've done everything you can to repay these loans. You know, there's been a little bit of movement into, you know, there was maybe a slightly more favorable case out of the Ninth Circuit and just recently, and, you know, we hear these little, oh, well, this judge is maybe a little bit less strict than others, and this panel maybe, you know, lightened up the test a little bit. But the reality is it's impossible to, for most people to discharge student loans under that undue hardship test.
Thank you. Hello, I'm with the American Association of University Women. And my question is, what can we do when we talk to students about borrowing to ensure that they realize that it can be more difficult for women when they're going into the workforce to pay back their loans because of the pay gap?
Well, I could take first crack at that. You know, in our work with counselors in schools, I think that, you know, to the best of their ability, the process that they follow is one of assessing risk. I mean, it's interesting because while the lenders are on their side assessing risk, the students are making their own calculations. And in an ideal world, if students and families had access to good information, I think, and I think to the extent that our counselors do, and again, I'm speaking about schools and students that are lucky enough to have good, strong counseling, you know, you'd want to talk to a student based on his or her circumstances. I mean, I think that one of the response items that we picked up in our survey research is that the guidance that gets delivered to students is often highly personalized based on the academic strength of the student, the field that they're interested in studying, you know, in the case of young women, the presence of young women in the field. I mean, it really, the answer to your question kind of depends on what field a young woman wants to go into. If she wants to go into STEM fields, she's going to be in high demand. Other fields she might not be in as much demand. So it is a delicate balancing act that I think that we have to consider, and certainly to the extent that there are differences in income based on any attribute that an individual can or maybe can't control, that would need to be factored into the conversation at the front end. That's a critical part of the process as we see it.
Hello. Dr. Baum, I was interested to hear you say that this kind of reform would not bankrupt lenders because, of course, that's exactly their response. So I was wondering if any of you on the panel would be willing to do any kind of tea leaf reading as to what effect you think this could have on the market, especially in regards to access, and if that's a real concern or not.
Well, one of the arguments that always is deeply disturbing to me is to say if you close off some avenue that is leading to really bad results, you are, undermining access. If these loans were dischargeable in bankruptcy, the lenders would be more careful about making those loans. And there are some people now getting loans who probably wouldn't get them, but those are mostly people who have a very low probability of ever paying them back. And it's a similar argument to the argument about whether you should sanction schools where nobody ever graduates or nobody ever pays off their loans. Because it is true that many of those schools enroll a lot of low-income students, but they enroll low-income students, and then those students' lives are worse than they would be if they didn't enroll there. Better, they shouldn't have that opportunity and should be directed to a different opportunity that might make their lives better. And if you can't get a private student loan, you might have to change and enroll in a different institution that doesn't charge as much. Great.
Let me say that the chart that we saw, I think, really tells us a lot about the answer to this question. Because until 2005, until October 14th, 2005, private student loans were 100% completely dischargeable in bankruptcy. Okay? That chart was showing a marked increase in these private student loans from what, around the mid-90s or so? And it continued until shortly after the Bankruptcy Reform Act was passed, at which point this so-called access to credit dropped off dramatically. Okay? They didn't make more wonderful loans available for people that needed them because they became non-dischargeable. If anything, the economy tanking and the banking regulators finally actually looking at what their banks were doing, I think finally resulted in that drop-off. It had nothing to do with the dischargeability or not in bankruptcy.
Can you put that graph up again? Mm-hmm. Didn't the drop-off come in, was it 2008?
The drop-off came in 2008-09. And that was the market crashing. But it's true that it was, I'm not sure if I...
It spiked after 2005.
It didn't spike after. It was already, the spike is continuing at a pretty steady...
So you can see there was more rapid growth, but it's not, so 2005-06 loans were not dischargeable, but 2004-05 there was huge growth. So it's really not, there's no break in the growth.
Yeah, the growth curve is steady. In fact, if you look at it, it's kind of topping off there around, the growth is actually, it's still increasing, but the rate of increase is going down starting around 2005. The economy was also sort of running out of steam a little bit around that point too, but in 06 and into 07. But there's no bump in that graph one way or the other starting in October of 2005.
And I would also point out that if you look at the housing crisis, you see charts that look just like this. Mm-hmm. And then if you look at the for-profit enrollment in the Hawkins report, another graph that just looks just like this, and the bankruptcy issue doesn't factor into that. It's quite astounding, the similarities between the graphs, actually.
And it's supply and demand, right? And so the for-profit growth of the for-profit sector has a lot to do with the demand.
Right. We're not talking about discharging all of these loans. Right. We're not talking about discharging 10% of these loans. We're talking discharging, a couple percent. That 40% that are in default, that doesn't mean they're all going to file bankruptcy. Bankruptcy isn't the solution for everybody. Some of them are in default because people don't want to pay them. Some of them are in default because people are dead. Some of them are in default, but we'll get back on track. Not everybody with a defaulted loan is going to need to file bankruptcy. And the bankruptcy discharge, if the bankruptcy discharge is available, it's also going to help bring these lenders to the table to negotiate a non-bankruptcy solution to reschedule the payments and get people back on track without them actually having to file bankruptcy.
Another question?
Yeah. Congressman Sessions opened the session today saying that a bachelor's won't work anymore. You need a master's now. Given that higher education is even more expensive and there's a growth in these vocational, technical, and two-year alternatives, how do you see that affecting the private student loan market?
Well, one thing is that right now, if you're going to graduate school, you don't need private student loans because you can take grad plus loans. And so I'm not sure what's going to happen with those loans, but certainly students going to graduate school end up borrowing a lot of money. Much of the high debt, student debt, is graduate students, which is something we actually have to be very careful about as you think about improving the income-based repayment plans and making it easier for students to repay their loans, that a lot of the people with high student loan debt are doctors and lawyers. And, while some of them may have trouble paying back those big loans, they're not the population you're thinking about when you're really worrying about the problems people face. But as it stands, that shouldn't have, people going to graduate school is not a big part of this issue.
And I would also add that in terms of vocational programs, if students are looking, particularly adult learners, are looking to improve on their credentials and train for a specific occupation, the market would seem to dictate that education be not only accessible but affordable, because that would be a pretty key component to that. And I think that this chart shows you that there's a great deal of speculation out there in this industry where we had programs that the market would dictate be priced at a relatively low level were actually being priced at an extremely high level that would rival private nonprofit 4-year baccalaureate degrees. So I think what we're going to be looking at now is a bit of a correction. With this chart, the drop off there coincides with some regulations that were put in place at the Department of Education, and I think the market correction would dictate that these prices come down somewhat. But the fact is, as we've said earlier, there's still going to be borrowers getting into the system that may eventually encounter some challenges that may need to be solved.
Let me say about this comment about doctors and lawyers. While a lot of doctors and lawyers do graduate with high student loan debt, it's not just doctors and lawyers who are going to graduate school. It's teachers. You're supposed to have a master's degree now for a lot of teaching positions. And, we all know what teachers make. Not very much. The other thing is, certainly, doctors and lawyers, we want lawyers to get out and do, public interest work. We want doctors to go serve our underserved communities. These loans are forcing people to, take the most lucrative type positions available rather than going into the fields that they want to go into and that we really need them to go into. Not every doctor or lawyer makes a lot of money. Speaking from personal experience. We want to encourage people to go into the public service professions. And if we want lawyers and doctors to do that, we need to have, some sort of a safety valve for this type of situation.
Let me just say, I totally agree with that, and we do have those safety valves. And the problem is that some of the other safety valves that we're developing aren't going to help those people, they're going to help the other people.
Looks like we have one more question.
My question is to Dr. Baum. Basically, I want to ask, do you think the increase in interest rates for federal loans and the possibility of the the decrease in Pell Grants would mean that a lot of the students are going towards the private loan, and a possibility of the growth increasing according to your chart?
So I hoped we wouldn't do the interest rate question today, but let me just say on this 6.8, 3.4%, that almost everybody who's taking these subsidized student loans at 3.4% is already is also borrowing unsubsidized loans. That most of the, a growing proportion of the federal student loans are unsubsidized anyway. So the suggestion that if you just could keep the interest rate on this small fraction of the federal student loans low, you're going to solve people's problems, you're not. So I would urge that we think more broadly about the right way to set interest rates on student loans so that they work well for students, so that students are not trapped by the moment at which they took a loan or by paying exorbitant interest rates or pushed into private loans. But the solution is going to have to be a bigger solution than just what we do on that small fraction of loans, of subsidized loans.
All right, with that, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. We've gone way past our time allotment, but thank you so much to the panelists and to both members of Congress here who've shown leadership on this issue, and thank you all for attending.